Gentlemen, of the media, welcome to a Partnership for National Unity's press conference for today, the 14th day of November 2012. On today's press conference panel, the panel will be dealing with Finance and the Public Accounts Committee. To my left is Mr. Carl Greenidge, Shadow Minister of Finance and of course Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee and a Partnership for National Unity. To his left is Mr. Jaipal Sharma, also another finance representative in a Partnership for National Unity, a Member of Parliament. And to his left is Mr. Keith Scott, Member of Parliament, a Partnership for National Unity and leader of the National Front Alliance. The statement will be read today by Mr. Greenidge.
Ladies and gentlemen, I bid you good morning and thank you for taking the time to join us this morning to hear what we have to say on matters pertaining to finance. This morning I want to speak a little bit about the issue of conflict of interest, code of conduct, and the work of the Public Accounts Committee in relation to these areas and the question of appointments. Some of these issues have been, as you probably are no doubt aware, capturing the attention of the press and various commentators, stirring quite a lot of controversy. So part of the intention here is to clarify the situation in relation to these matters. Now, at the last meeting, the 10th meeting of the Public Accounts Committee, which took place on the 5th of this month, the PPP representative complained about the inclusion of the name of the wife of Dr. Ashni Singh in a letter that I had been required to send to the Chartered Accountants Oversight Institutes. There's one in Guyana, one in the Caribbean, looking after regional business, and one in the United Kingdom, responsible for international matters. And Mrs. Teixeira voiced concern that the name of Mrs. Singh should not have been mentioned, nor should the Minister of Finance have been mentioned. Of course, as you know, in the eyes of much of Guyana, the appointment of Mrs. Singh to the position of director and de facto deputy within the Audit Office generates the potential for conflict of interest. And it's generating the potential in a context where Guyana has been ranked as the second most corrupt country in Latin America and the Caribbean, and certainly the most corrupt in the Caribbean itself. And in those circumstances, the work of the Office of Audit becomes exceedingly important. Its professionalism and bipartisanism is critical, and because of that, it is important that appointments to positions in this office attract a consensus, okay? Because both sides would want to be assured that work is to be carried out impartially. And arising from that belief, there was a discussion at the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee wrote or had me write to these bodies, and the bodies have been asked to give advice in relation to a code of conduct that they may have, and the name of the two persons was mentioned specifically because without reference to these two persons, it would be meaningless. I mean, what foreigner would know who Mrs. Singh is, who Mr. Singh is, and that there's the connection that Mr. Singh has oversight of the bodies that are to be audited by his wife. That is why it was mentioned, and I think it unfortunate that the PPP and their representatives would find that the mention was inappropriate. But what is perhaps more problematic has been that Mrs. Teixeira indicated to us that she has subsequently written to the institutes, these oversight bodies, with a view to suggesting to them that the Public Accounts Committee didn't intend that names should be mentioned, and the perhaps intention of the PPP here is to avoid the consequences that a close inquiry may have by way of embarrassment and exposure of, if you like, practices that are really malpractices. So that has been one of the things that came out of the exchange on the 5th. In the interim, the committee itself is in the throes, that's the Public Accounts Committee, is in the throes of trying to ensure that the plenary is brought up to date, and that the relevant bodies, that is the Standing Orders Committee, looks at the standing orders pertaining to the question of voting within the Public Accounts Committee. If I might just remind you, and I'm reminding you because there has been what I see reinforcing a tendency in this country for persons who seek to attract public attention, whether it is by way of comments in the newspapers, on the internet, or on television, to deign to pronounce on things without even attempting to read the relevant documents that they are purporting to quote. As regards the standing orders, you will have seen, you will be aware, those of you that will attend Parliament, that at the time of the discussion of the proposals from the Office of Audit, to discuss the promotions recommended by the acting Auditor General, Mr. Sharma, at the time, the two sides found themselves in a situation in which the PPP had a temporary majority caused by the absence of Mr. Williams, an AFC representative from the committee, and in those circumstances, they insisted, contrary to traditional practice, on voting on the matter. The PPP, having found itself in a temporary majority, sought to vote on the matter, whereas, as I indicated, on a matter that is as politically sensitive as these appointments, they would normally it's the normal practice to work by consensus. The result was that when the vote was called, as chair, I attempted to vote in that first round. Members, I needn't identify which side, objected, saying that the standing orders didn't permit the chair to vote. In those circumstances, in any circumstances where there's a dispute over the rules, it is the guardian of those rules, that is the clerk of the National Assembly and his officers, who give guidance on the rules. And the guidance was sought, and the clerk drew our attention to the standing orders that he thought was relevant. These are the circumstances. No one else was consulted as such. The meeting has to live by the rules that the House as a whole establishes. It has to live by the rules set out in the standing orders. And the chair, and I have had the opportunity to chair innumerable international bodies at the level of the United Nations, at the level of EU and the ACP and elsewhere, and it is not for the chairman to either seek to abort the decision that is properly arrived at according to rules, or to impose his own or his party's. The chairman is supposed to be an impartial arbiter in running the meeting, and these were the circumstances. Now, if you have a look at the standing orders 48.2, as well as standing order 85, you will see, if you look at the standing orders, you see none of them refer specifically to the capacity of the chair of the Public Accounts Committee to vote, to cast a primary vote. And where in those two standing orders there is reference, the suggestion is that the chair, the 85, pertains to select committees, not the standing committee, which is the Public Accounts Committee. It says he doesn't have a vote. Okay, however, if you look further in the standing orders, 112, I think it's 112.2, you will see those standing orders make provision for, in the absence of a specific rule in relation to the standing committee, or any of the committees, for the House to have resort to the practice at the level of the plenary, if there is such a practice, and in the absence of that, to go to the practice in the United Kingdom from which these constitutions derive. And in both those cases, the outcome is very clear. Erskine Mays, which captures the practice in the United Kingdom, does not give the chair the primary vote. And if you have a look, I can remind you on the 22nd of September, there was a vote pertaining to an AFC motion to ensure the independence of the Parliament office. That vote ended up in a tie, and the chairman didn't vote. Okay, so it is at least ambiguous. Let me put it that way. The rules as they stand, as regards the power of the chair, and there's certainly the weight of the number of the rules. And if you also look at the supporting documents for the rules, for example, the section 311 of the Manual of Rules and Procedures and Operations, you will see that it says, in the second sentence, 310 rather, the chairperson shall not have an original vote, but in the event of an equality of votes, he or she shall give a casting vote. In the case of the Public Accounts Committee, the number of votes was 4 on one side and 3 on the other. There's not an equality of votes, okay? So I just wanted to draw that to your attention. The National Assembly itself can be expected to look at these matters in the coming weeks, because the Standing Orders Committee has been asked to look at the conflicting rules that I've just referred you to, and the Public Accounts Committee is in the process of finalizing a report which was prepared quite a while ago for consideration by the plenary, by the House itself, in relation to the process and the implications of the appointment of the staff of the audit department in the manner that I indicated to you, mainly other than by consensus, and including the appointment of at least one person in relation to whose appointment there is widespread concern throughout Guyana regarding the question of a conflict of interest. That is the basic statement I'd like to put to you, and of course I'm here like that.
Folks, you're now free to pose your questions, identify yourselves and the media house you're representing. Please use the microphone.
Questions that are would the opinions from these international oversight bodies be binding on the government?
Thank you, Kwesi. The opinions themselves would not be binding because the international bodies can't tell the government of Guyana what to do. However, the Audit Office is a member of these bodies, and there are, although the Auditor General is one of them, both the minister and his wife are professionals, okay, if you like, underwritten by these bodies. The codes of conduct of these bodies are supposed to apply to the professionals, okay? So what they say should be of import to the professionals, and of course these bodies have rules, which rules, when enforced, have sanctions, okay, when they are infringed.
Mr. Greenwich, from your point of view, do you see any link between your recommendation by the AG to appoint Mr. Singh as his deputy, and further a link between the two appointments, because he just recently been confirmed? Right? How does this play out?
Well, I'm not in a position to answer that definitively, but let me just say this is precisely why the practice in the sister countries of the region, in the United Kingdom, is to ensure that these appointments are done by consensus, to remove any doubt that appointments are made in any partisan or biased manner. The current Auditor General was acting at the time. It is of some concern, and perhaps it begs the question, why would an administration which has for over 8 years fought tooth and nail not to have staff of the Audit Office confirmed, right, on grounds that they were not properly qualified, they were not formally qualified, even though they had been in office for many years, performing the function, some of them at a very senior level, and then suddenly you agree to go through and appoint all of them, irrespective of concerns that might still, or some specific concerns voiced in relation to one or two, apart from the problem of formal qualifications. And then suddenly you clear their appointment. The AG, who's also been acting for a long time, his appointment is clear at the same time as he has been prepared to recommend, and the PPP was able to engineer the appointment of these persons, including Mrs. Singh. It is a strange coincidence. It is an unusual coincidence, and I think that the question you raise is a very valid one. The PPP has to answer that, and the facts have to answer for them.
My next question is, Mr. Singh has been appointed, right, irrespective of what went on at the PSC level. What can be done now to remedy that situation if an advice does come back that it's a glaring case of conflict of interest?
Well, even without the advice, the Public Accounts Committee members had the benefit of some suggestions, and it is an obvious solution. It is not unusual for two spouses to be found in an entity, and then for one of them to be or seek to be promoted to a position that would enable one supervising or overseeing the other. It is usually unacceptable in circumstances where finances are concerned. Okay? You wouldn't allow a man or a woman to audit the spouse's work in those circumstances, or even to monitor it. So what is normally done in reputable institutions is to transfer the person, usually the less senior of the two. Mrs. Singh worked elsewhere at a very senior level before being moved to the Audit Office, and there is absolutely no reason institutionally why she could not be reassigned by the government to another agency. It is it is deplorable, I would say, as strongly a term as that, that they should seek to insist that she remain there, arguing that there's no conflict of interest, when clearly at an intuitive level, such a conflict can arise and may have already arisen. And there has been no attempt to move her. In fact, you now attempt to give her a more senior and more powerful position within the entity.
I have a question on EasyJet. Once again, we've seen another airline fiasco. Is there any way the PAC can play a greater role in the review, the monitoring of these crucial sectors like airline?
Well, I think that there are a number of bodies in the House that can examine the workings by way of the award of licenses to these companies. Of course, the license is issued from both on the Guyana side and the US, so it's not only our responsibility. But I would think that this is more in keeping when discussions are held at budget time in relation to the Ministry of Transport, Ministry of Works, and also in the Economic Services Committee, which looks at the entities, the sectors, and how they are regulated and supervised. I don't think in the first instance, and I stand subject to advice here, I don't think in the first instance it is the PAC's responsibility, as a first step. Of course, questions sometimes can be asked to the extent that the Auditor General may have raised a query, or some matter of policy throws up questions of funding or finance. But I don't think in the first instance it would be responsibility of the PAC.
Coming to the Economic Service Committee, do you think the opposition did staunch enough job in examining this project?
Which project?
The same EasyJet stuff.
Well, I am not aware that the EasyJet exercise went to the Economic Services Committee. Certainly, for the financial year 2012, the Economic Services Committee has not been formally constituted because there is an outstanding controversy, shall I put it that way, between the PPP and the opposition parties over the allocation of seats. And for as long as the government can hold out on this matter, nothing happens in relation to the working of these committees.
So as the PSC began to look at the Auditor General report presented to the House, and if so, from your perusal of the report, the Auditor General basically gave broad outlines of defaults in certain ministries and sectors, and not specific, more to say, and in instances would have said that the Auditor General has written to the particular ministry or so and querying those stuff, but not specifically stating in the report, what those infringes are. Just a broad outline in most cases. After I would have examined the report a little bit, except for talking about the bank accounts, those that were not transferred, that should be closed and if some transferred to the consolidated funds. The contingency fund was mentioned briefly as well. What's your take?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's true to say that the Auditor General's report on the audit of the accounts for 2010, which is what we're currently working on, made no mention of specific infringements, specific actions of agencies and ministries in relation to the laws, that is the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act, or the regulations that are governed or administered, overseen by the Financial Secretary and the Accountant General. In fact, we have already examined for 2010 a number of ministries. I think you need to separate two things. First of all, in the executive summary of the Auditor General's report, there are general observations. That is only the executive summary, and those general observations highlight categories, such as you've mentioned yourself. In a couple of instances, they may have mentioned it mentions ministries, but it also deals with broader infringements in relation to those areas. The Auditor General's report was quite strong, and I think the Public Accounts Committee was similarly concerned, if not alarmed, over a number of areas. The Financial Secretary was eventually asked to explain how it is that the contingencies fund could have been allowed to access funds in that particular year of over $500 million for projects and in circumstances that conflicted with the criteria set out in the Fiscal Management and Accountability Act. That is a strong criticism. The term he uses is abuse. Okay, abuse of the contingencies fund. There are references, as you quite rightly say, to failure to close bank accounts that are decades old. And in those cases, the Public Accounts Committee heard explanations from the Accountant General. It wasn't satisfied with those explanations. It sought to understand why it is that the information, he said, was unavailable, and the processing, which hadn't been completed. Why was that the case? Was it a staffing problem? Was it a question of priorities and so forth? He was asked to look at it and come back with a report on it. The Financial Secretary also said that he needed to look at the question of the contingencies fund, and we deem this a very, very alarming area, because it is not the first time. It is not the first time that there have been complaints. Now, in relation to the agencies, we've looked at Works, Education, Foreign Affairs, GDF, and so forth, and a number of specific instances were cited. For example, a private contractor would have sums outstanding, significant sums outstanding to a ministry or an agency, and that ministry or agency is unable to recoup funds from the contractor, some of which arose from overpayments. And the ministry blithely carries on and gives him a new set of contracts, notwithstanding the fact that he owes them. And it was suggested that in some instances this seemed to have been done even to facilitate the contractor. And the concern of both sides of the House was raised in this regard, that it was unacceptable, and it needs to stop in cases where staff were overpaid, amounts not recouped after years, some of them going back to pre-1998. In a small country, some instances people went off on leave without properly notifying the agencies for which they worked. But the question is, in many of these instances, were their accumulated benefits or remaining benefits with the agencies checked and the sums owed retained? Did they bother to look to see into that possibility, or were people just simply allowed to go off with funds belonging to the taxpayer? So, without trying to go through all of them for you and to say that these are the sum total of the findings of the Public Accounts Committee, because it hasn't finished, they were specific enough things for us to work on. One of the ones at the more general level had to do with the collection of revenues owed to the Consolidated Fund. Agencies, a number of agencies, are obliged to pay funds over into the Consolidated Fund. The Auditor General asked whether he could give the assurance that these funds had been collected, whether the agencies responsible for paying over the funds had been identified and he had got an assurance, or he was satisfied that they paid over. The Auditor General could not give such an assurance. And we therefore turned to the Financial Secretary, who similarly was not able to answer. And he's undertaken to have a look, a careful examination, and come back to let us know which of the agencies which are supposed to pay over and what is the state of play. To us, it was really worrying. It is like having a shop, if I might use an analogy here, in which you're selling bags of flour, bags of cement, sweets, and so forth, and the person with oversight of the shop is more concerned with whether 3 or 4 sweets from the sweetie jar are missing relative to where you were yesterday, as opposed to the money for the cement and flour, which having been paid out, he can't say to you whether he's received payments for these. Something has to be wrong, and I hope that the Financial Secretary is going to come to us with a system that gives us the assurance that revenues owed to the state are collected, because if those revenues aren't collected, we find ourselves paying as personal income tax or as corporation tax in the case of companies more taxes than we should be paying. We should be paying more value-added tax than we should be paying because monies due to the state have not been collected. When that isn't happening, or in addition to us having to pay more taxes, then those agencies that are expenditure agencies, hospitals and schools, will not have the services that they should have because the monies that should have been available to them, should have been collected for these services, have not been collected. So it's not a theoretical issue we're raising here. These are important issues, okay? And the closing of bank accounts, also very important. So there are a range of areas that we've looked at, including, for example, the monitoring of payments to contractors and how the agencies enforce the elements of contract in relation to these businesses.
My name is Greenwich.
Yes,
Chevy Devonish from Stanford News. I'm very glad you raised this particular issue. Now, this question is in relation to the last PAC meeting on Monday, where the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sport were asked to justify them doing what was referred to as roll-over projects. Now, the permanent secretary of the ministry admitted that him keeping the funds, which should have been paid back into the consolidated fund at the end of the year, was wrong. And the only thing I noticed came out of that is that he promised that it would not happen in this particular year. Now, knowing that that particular issue is, as was suggested, against the law, are there any measures that are going to be taken to ensure, penalty measures, if I'm to be specific, that are going to be taken to ensure that ministry officials honor their obligations in these particular cases? Because the government chief whip, Gilda, I remember she attempts to justify this particular action referring to the Procurement Act. Nevertheless, the permanent secretary admitted that no permission was sought, no permission was given. So in light of this, what measures are going to be taken, or are any measures going to be taken to ensure that these officials conform to the law?
Thank you very much for a very important question, which reinforces my point that there are specific enough instances in the Auditor General's report for ministries and agencies to be quizzed over their behavior and over infringements of the law and the Financial Act. First of all, in looking at a number of these cases, the members of the Public Accounts Committee did express the view, did caution some of the PSAs, that the Public Accounts Committee proposes to take action in instances that are glaring action, including surcharging of officials for infringements of the rules and regulations. As regards the law itself, of course, you have other agencies that can pursue that. But if I might just continue with this particular one, you will remember, as regards the Ministry of Youth, Culture, that during the course of the debate on the 2012 budget, in the Committee of Supply, this question of the National Youth Commission, for example, which is one of the agencies identified in the Auditor General's report for 2010, it appeared again in 2012. And when the minister gave information suggesting that in 2012 they would be spending more money than was actually allocated to them in 2012, or that they were requested in 2012, after a number of exchanges and quizzes, it turned out that they were in receipt of monies and they were rolling them over. They were in receipt of money in 1 year, rolling it over to the next. Part of the problem we have here will have to be to work with the Financial Secretary, the Accountant General, as well as the Auditor General to stop these practices which are illegal. In the case of these entities under Youth and Culture, you have entities that are really part of the ministry, in fact, because they have no separate constitution, there is no separate system of accountability. They are in fact part of the ministry, to which the ministry gives lump sum votes illegally, so that they don't have to account for the use of the money, either capital or current, and then they hold it from 1 year to the next. This is illegal. And if you were there, you would have recalled that I made mention of this, of the 212 case, and asked whether this vote, subvention to local organizations, which is the head under which these monies came, was not being used as a device for facilitating bypassing the law. And the answer was in fact just that. So we will seek to take action against the agencies such as this one for such funds. What we can't do, specifically in relation to 2012 budget, will ensure doesn't recur in 2013. So when the public sees that $1 has been assigned to agencies, they must understand why. These are some of the reasons. Where the government has a law to monitor its own laws that it passed in its own time, and then seeks to breach those laws in a number of ways, we are not going to provide funds to the agencies. Yes, Mr. Mbra.
Or I will ask the question.
No, go ahead, use the mic.
No, I will ask the question.
Well, while Mr. Mbra is deciding, I don't know if any of the other two gentlemen on the panel would like to make any statement.
No, not that.
Khan, have you decided? Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen of the media, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you at our or other press conference. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.